everybody to this newest and first 2022 edition of the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Joseph. I know it's been quite a while since I did my last episode, which was back in May when I did all of the V series of unproduced prototypes. I've just been busy, been fighting a pandemic. I just shot a new film, and I just haven't had too much time to really dive deep into the action figures that I loved and I grew up with and sharing my thoughts and my memories with you guys. So I apologize for that. I hope to make it up a little bit this year, but you're not going to see me do this as much just because of my time and my priorities as of late. So I'm going to probably do these every now and then just to kind of keep this podcast going, but I don't know how much longer I'm going to be doing this. And it's not because, it's not like we're getting millions of subscribers and hits. It's just the simple fact that it's a time factor and it's a lot to research and just to even think about what did I grow up with that was movie related when it came to action figures. And I feel like I covered a lot of ground since I started this. Anyway, I was kind of deciding today, because I just need a little bit of a break from what I'm doing right now with my post production, that I needed to talk about one of the other figures I never spoke about in this podcast. And I was deciding between Indiana Jones or Rocky. And after some back and forth, I decided, why don't we go into Indiana Jones and I'll save Rocky for another day. In fact, I want to do Rocky along with some other Sylvester Stallone related movies that had figures later in another podcast. So, Indiana Jones, where do I begin here? So, we spoke about the action figures with the Junk Man about 2 years ago. If you ever followed that Junk Man on YouTube, I highly recommend him. He's really knee deep in what he does in talking about classic film properties and, of course, his love for Star Wars. I grew up with Indiana Jones in a very weird way. So, I remember the first time I saw a movie was The Temple of Doom. It was on Channel 11 here in New York. It must have been about 87 or 88. And I didn't get into it right away. I thought it was a little weird, with Indiana Jones on the bridge, evading the thuggies on after the big scene with the mine cart. But I remember being hooked on it because here's this guy with this fedora, with this blonde chick and this Asian young boy who kicks a lot of ass in that. I thought, okay, this is pretty cool. I got to watch the whole thing one day, but I thought it was pretty nice. And then it wasn't too long after that when The Last Crusade came out, and I remember all the trailers for it. I remember it was like this big deal of a movie because it was the third film in the series, and I didn't see it in the theaters because I was big into my Ghostbusters fandom and eventually my Batman fandom. But I managed to see Last Crusade when it came out on video when my parents rented it. I remember my cousin was really crazy about it. And that blew me away. And I remember watching that repeatedly on HBO after its release. So I didn't know the order of things. I didn't know much about Raiders of the Lost Ark. I do remember my dad had bought the VHS in the early infancy of VHS tapes. And he must have paid almost close to $90 because you got to remember back in those days, buying a video cassette was like buying a car. It was not cheap compared to when DVDs came out. You could buy a good DVD for like 17, $20, maybe even cheaper than that. No, these things were pricey if you grew up in the 1980s and in the 90s. So, I kind of hesitated on watching Raiders for a very long time because I wasn't really into Indiana Jones. But once I got into Star Wars and then the Star Wars phase kind of fizzled out a little bit, I started getting into George Lucas's next property, which was Indiana Jones. And I finally relented and decided I was going to take my dad's Raiders tape and I was just going to watch it. And it was cool because it had the teaser for Temple of Doom. So, obviously it was coming. This tape came out as that movie was being produced. And again, Raiders was like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. I had seen clips on TV and many retrospectives of the famous Doom Ball scene, the fight with the mechanic and all the other classic moments that everybody recalls, the Well of Souls, and just every classic moment about Indiana Jones. It really is arguably the greatest action movie of all time. It set a new standard, which threw back to the classic serials that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas grew up with, but then also using those serials and the special effects techniques of those time and brought it up to a standard that nobody had ever really seen before back in 1981. And it really changed the game in terms of pacing, in terms of action movies would only have like maybe three set pieces. This had every set piece was memorable, and there was so much to dissect from it. And Harrison Ford was at that point no longer just Han Solo. He was now a bona fide movie star after this, and really defined a new type of action hero in the 1980s that cemented his legacy as one of the greatest to ever do it. And he's been an inspiration to me, especially as I got into movies and my acting career a bit, as well as Spielberg and what he was able to provide on that movie. And George Lucas, obviously, this was his story, this was his baby. And I don't need to go much further than that. I mean, Raiders, there's just no topping it. I consider Last Crusade to be kind of neck and neck, but I could say a different story on a different day. We'll talk about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull later, but I want to talk about the action figures for Indiana Jones because, of course, 1981, Kenner was just rocking it with Star Wars action figures. It really was, as I mentioned in the Star Wars episodes, what may have defined that franchise, not just the movie, but also those figures that every kid in America wanted to buy and they wanted to live out being Luke Skywalker, being Han Solo, flying the Millennium Falcon, blowing up the Death Star, fighting Darth Vader. You could do that with these 3.25 inch action figures that they were producing. So naturally, with that success and the genius of George Lucas, the genius of Steven Spielberg, it wasn't surprising when Kenner decided to take up the license for Raiders. And it began in 1982, a year after the movie came out, when they finally dished out some action figures and play sets. And it was a pretty interesting set because they went and took an older toy line from another movie that was not so successful, which was Butch and Sundance, the early years. And that came out in 1979. At that time, Westerns weren't selling, and certainly those figures did not sell. So there were a lot of remolds, a lot of the same articulations were added to this Indiana Jones set. So we're going to talk about each series in a little bit and the play sets that they came with. So for the first set, surprisingly, there were only 4 action figures. And I guess that makes sense because they didn't know how much they were going to sell at that time. You had your Indiana Jones figure, which had all kinds of articulation. And by the way, this was different from Star Wars because with the Star Wars figures, there were only 4 points of articulation with the arms, the legs, and the heads can move from side to side. That's all they could do. Some of these figures had action techniques that the Star Wars figures didn't have, so that was carried from the Butch and Sundance line. The Indiana Jones figure in particular had a quick draw action with its arm. So if you wanted to have Indy crack his whip or pull out a gun and shoot somebody just like in the movie, you could do just that with this figure. The head is essentially like the Han Solo head because Harrison Ford did both movies, so they were trying to capture that. But its head is stuck on with the hat. You can't remove the hat. Other than that, it's dead on in its accuracy with the jacket, the shirt, the pants. Basically they definitely had remolded some of these Butch and Sundance figures and just repainted it and made it into Indiana Jones. And that's fine. People bought into it, and that's all you needed. And that was your Indiana Jones right there. The Marion Ravenwood figure was very interesting. This one, it's very hard to find. And I could just tell you firsthand that When I started hunting for these figures in toy fairs, they were not easy to find and they definitely were not cheap. And Marion Ravenwood was undoubtedly the one that avoided me the most. I mean, first of all, there's not a whole lot of articulation with this figure. There's no knee joints, and it has this removable fabric dress along with it. If you remember when she gets captured by the Nazis, Belloc gives her this white dress to wear. So they basically recreated that. And I think that's what makes the figure so expensive in comparison to like any of the Princess Leia toys for Star Wars, because it's just so well designed. It's almost like a little Barbie figure in a sense. And the only accessory it comes with is that infamous monkey in the movie, the one that is causing all kinds of trouble for Indy and Marion until it eats a poisoned date and dies. So I think it's kind of funny that they actually added this as an accessory. And it definitely has sort of the look of Karen Allen. Other than that, again, it's a very hard figure to find because there weren't that many produced back in '82 because there was a whole thing about girls and boys' toys that didn't quite sell. So I guess that was the issue. But, when Hasbro took over the license with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, we're going to get a lot of this. So we'll talk back about Mary and some of the other ladies in the Indiana Jones series. Next, we had Tote, the infamous Nazi with the long overcoat and the glasses. He was very interesting. So the coat could be taken off. It was like a little plastic thing that didn't really move much. You could remove the coat. And what's cool about the movie is if you remember the film, he's going after Marion in his first scene, who has this medallion that's a big piece of trying to find the Ark of the Covenant. And during the shootout in her bar, he tries to grab the medallion while it's caught in a fireplace, and it ends up scarring his hand. So the burned part of the hand is actually added to the figure, and it could actually be raised up. And I'm not going to do the Hitler thing, not here, but you can't see me anyway. They added that, so that was like a really cool detail to have back then for these figures, and it definitely looks like the actor Ron Lacey in all areas. I mean, this is probably the best figure in the whole series, in my opinion. And then the infamous Cairo swordsman, who only has one scene in this movie. They created that figure of the infamous swordsman who has his sword, removable robe, and one knife. So this is also included with the Monkey Man figure in the Streets of Cairo place which we'll talk about in a bit. And if you remember that moment in the movie, when they originally shot that scene, it was supposed to be a big fight, but then Harrison Ford did one take where all he did was just watch the guy do his sword play and then take the gun and shoot him. So, I mean, technically they didn't have to make this guy as a figure, but what the hell? It's one of the most memorable scenes in the whole movie, so why not have it? Now, in this first release, this is also where they had the offer for a mail away figure. So if you got enough points, you could sign up and mail away for a Belloc figure. And they made Belloc with the ceremonial robe that he wears at the very end of the movie when he opens up the Ark. And this is another rare figure, much like Marion, that's very difficult to find and very expensive. This one has a removable robe. It has the jewel breastplate that he wears around his neck, and he also has the staff that he wears, and his the headpiece that he wears cannot be removed. But there will be another Belloc figure, which we'll get to in a moment. This one also, I remember, like even the cloth for the robe was very textured. So Kenner really did their part to give some serious detail to these figures that you didn't quite get with Star Wars. It just says a lot about why they're so expensive and why they're so rare to find. In the same series, we had two play sets. If you know the Star Wars play sets from that time, they were very much just like little stages of the different moments in the Star Wars movies. They do the same thing here with Indiana Jones, where they have the Well of Souls, and this is that scene when he finds the Ark, and it's pretty interesting because of its enormous amount of accessories. It has a mummy, It has 14 snakes because we know how much Indy hates snakes. It has two torches, a hook with a rope, like when he came down into the pyramid to go into the well, a crypt cover. It has the ark itself, so that was a nice little piece with the lid and the base. Some carrying poles, some torches, and a breakaway wall. So they really were going to town with this to recreate that scene in the film. And then you had the map room playset, which, much like Well of Souls, was a stage, but not as many accessories for this. And if you remember, that was like the scene with Indy going down into the well and using the staff to find the location of the ark. And this one comes with an additional Indiana Jones figure when he's wearing his Arab disguise, and he has his revolver in the plastic bag as well. So, in addition to the figure, you had the tripod, you had the Staff of Ra, you had a handbag, a book, a pick, a revolver, a hook, and a rope. And Indy with more of a 3 o'clock shadow beard, which you don't have with the regular figure. So again, the details on this are ridiculously nuts and probably a little bit more easier to find than the Well of Souls, but nonetheless, it's still significant for this line. I need to talk about the packaging for a second because this was also a lot of fun. They did not call these figures Raiders of the Lost Ark because I believe Kenner knew that there were going to be sequels after this and probably expected that they would continue to make figures for each movie. So rather than calling it Raiders of the Lost Ark, they called it Adventures of Indiana Jones because clearly this was their James Bond who was going to continue in a series of movies. And so each of these packagings had the different scenes depicted of each character as they were depicted based on the figures that they made. Now, again, they re released all of the same figures from the first set, but now there were new figures to offer in this go around. So, this is the set where we get Sala, who was Indy's friend in Cairo. And this one, was a little bit heavier because, much like John Rhys Davies, he's a pretty heavy guy. And he's got a removable robe, he has a torch, and basically looks like he does in the Well of Souls scene. And again, looks really great with the beard and the headpiece that can't be removed. And that's Sala. You had Indiana Jones in a German uniform, so that's like near the end of the movie where he disguises himself as one of the Nazis in trying to get the Ark and save Marion. So this is an indie figure that comes with a bazooka and also has a quick draw action. Much like the map room indie, this one has the 5 o'clock shadow or the 3 o'clock shadow beard because again, this guy doesn't shave for several days while he's out trying to get the ark. So this was also pretty cool. Although you could also, in a sense, use this figure to be like an additional Nazi if you wanted to pretend it wasn't indie. So you could almost like mix and match, not necessarily make it Indiana Jones in a sense. Now you get the infamous German mechanic figure from that famous fight scene in the movie. And this one also has a quick draw action arm, much like Indy does, if you want to recreate that fight scene. And yeah, I mean, this guy, much like the actor in the movie, is big, he is buff, he is bald, and looks pretty damn intimidating. And he comes with a wrench. So yeah, if you want to do the big fight scene in that movie, here you go. We get a regular Belloc figure for this line. So if you remember, he was played by Paul Freeman, best known for Ivan Ooze in the Power Rangers movie. Shout out to Jesse Job in here. This figure only has one accessory, which is a small paper map. But he has the look that he has throughout the whole film in this white garb that he wears. And, being the main bad guy, he looks pretty much like the actor here and has the points of articulation. So that was cool to have. And interestingly enough, I guess now you didn't have to do that mail away in 1982 because Kenner went off and decided we're going to release the Belloc in the robe as a regular figure in the stores. So this one was only released to very few stores, and it had pretty much everything that the mail away figure had. There were no changes whatsoever, except it's just carded, and it has that moment from the very last scene in the movie. In addition to those figures, we get the Arabian horse from the truck chase scene. So the Arabian white horse that Indy rides on. This might have been carried over from Butch and Sundance. I can't recall. I would have to look that up. But it's a horse that has removable reins and a bridle and a saddle, and it has a galloping action, which there's a button on the horse on the right side to make it kind of gallop. So that was definitely different and probably one of the first animal figures for a Kenner line at that time. Unless they did it for Butch and Sundance, I would have to again go back and look at that. So that was the figures for the second set of the Indiana Jones line. And we got a couple more things here. We got our first and arguably only vehicle in the series, and that was the Desert Convoy truck from the truck chase in the movie. So it was designed with a pull rope feature, which, if you remember, Indy had to like hold onto this rope to get onto the truck. So this has a pull rope, which you could put any figure onto and have it drag around wherever you have it, and has probably the most loose parts with the truck already pre-assembled, but the only things not attached were like the canopy and the drag bar. So other than that, everything else is in there. You could fit as many, two figures into the set on the driver's side, the passenger side. It's got some spare tires and a luggage rack. So pretty much dead on like the movie. And we got one more figure, one more play set, and that's the Streets of Cairo scene. And this is, if you remember, I mentioned the Monkey Man earlier, who came with that evil monkey. He's in this set. And not only that, but we get another Marion figure, but it's a weird kind of thing where it's a crouched down Marion that doesn't move at all. It's like almost like a little ball of her. And we also get the monkey again, but in a slightly different pose. And this one has a bunch of different things, like a cart. Um, it's got a lot of fruits. It's got baskets. I mean, just it's something to have if you want to have your figures run through the set, just like in the movie, or recreate the Cairo swordsman scene. It's not a big thing. It was just done, I guess, to have more fun and to recreate those moments in the film. I can't leave this set without talking about the 12-inch Indiana Jones doll, which again I expected that they expected it was going to be as big as Star Wars. But they were kind of lazy about it. So if you remember, Albert Albanese and I, in some episodes, talked about the way that companies like Kenner and Hasbro would just recycle old molds from old figure lines and then just bring them back for a later set. In this case, they took the Han Solo figure that had already been made for Star Wars, and they just took the same body and then just put Indiana Jones clothes on it. So his hair, you could tell, is the Han Solo hairstyle, not the Indiana Jones hairstyle, which was a little bit more shorter and doesn't have the 3 o'clock shadow beard. That's the one thing that kind of throws me off about it. And other than that, I mean, it has everything else removable. It's got the whip, the gun. You can remove the hat, and the other thing that's kind of weird about it is that he has blue eyes instead of brown, and I believe Harrison Ford's eyes are naturally brown. So go figure on this. This was just lazy molding and designing just so they could save money on selling a new figure from an old line. I don't have exact numbers on how the Indiana Jones figures did in 82 and 83, but I would assume they were not huge sellers. And if you go back to the episode I did with the Drunk Man, I asked him this question, why that the Indiana Jones figures didn't sell. And quite simply put, and he said it best, kids want to be Indiana Jones. They don't want to play with Indiana Jones. With Star Wars, you had a variety of colorful characters from the rebellion side as well as the empire side. And then in between, you had all these creatures and alien characters from like the Mos Eisley scene in the original film, the Boba Fett and all the other bounty hunters and Empire. There was a lot to choose from in that imaginary world that George Lucas created. Whereas Indiana Jones is a 1930s set serial, and there's just for some reason kids in the 80s who loved Indiana Jones probably just wanted to go to see those movies for the experience. But they weren't willing to go as far as, oh, I want to buy a toy of a guy who fights Nazis and rides trucks and goes into caves and pyramids to find treasures. Kids rather put on the hat and grab a whip and go in their backyard and pretend that they're Indiana Jones. I think that's why these figures didn't catch on and they weren't as colorful as the Star Wars figures. They were well designed and they were well detailed, but that's as far as it went. And as a result, Kenner dropped the line in 1983 and chose not to go forward with figures for the Temple of Doom. Instead, they went to another company, LJN, which was already making figures for another Spielberg movie, E.T., which we talked about in the Spielberg episode. And the least to say about this, the better. They were not very good. So they made only three figures that were now 6 inches instead of the G.I. Joe size figures from the Raiders line. And these figures didn't have the same amount of articulation. Now we're back to really 4 points of articulation, but with arms that can move from sideway to sideway, and some figures can move their legs, some couldn't. And they were not as detailed as those figures. They're okay, but they're not great. The new Indiana Jones figure was essentially almost like the Batman size figure. It had, this time, the hat could be removed, and it came with the fedora, no gun. It had a removable bag, and it came with a sword because there's that famous picture of Indy with the sword in the final scenes, so he has that. But the design is kind of flimsy. It's a little brighter than the Kenner figure, but it doesn't really look that much like Harrison Ford, and it's just not that very good. The Molaram figure is much better because at least this one has a lot more detail with his robe, and he's got the staff and the removable headgear that he wears when he's doing his little voodoo magic. But again, you can't move the legs much. You can only move just the two shoulders, and that's that. You know, it's well designed. It's probably the best figure in the series, but not much more to say than that. And then you had the giant Thuggy figure, which was just one of the henchmen of Mola Ram. And this is also one that has an axe, a sword, and a rope. And the same points of articulation, just like Indy does. The packaging is simply just the shot of Indy on the bridge just before he cuts the rope. There's no change, so there's no other scenes being depicted. And these figures are also very hard to find because there were only so few produced. Much like LJN, they were just kind of, they weren't as exciting as the Kenner figures. And of course, LJN being notorious for having prototypes that don't get released, we were supposed to get figures for Willie Scott, played by Kate Capshaw, and Short Round, played by Jonathan Key-Kwan. And they actually were going to have good scaling if had they been made, because the Willie figure was going to have like the casual looking outfit that she wears on the plane when they go to Bangkok Palace. And Short Round is very small from what I see in these pictures and looks a lot like the kid in the movie, but we never got those. And we were also supposed to get this fun looking minecart playset to recreate the minecart scene, but it almost looks like a Hot Wheels set from the picture that I see. No play sets other than that were planned, no other figures that I see. And I guess these were not good sellers because LJN just wasn't very good at these things back then. So if you find them, they're probably worth collecting just to have in the package. Otherwise, they weren't a whole lot of fun to play with. I don't own any of them. I contemplated buying them when I saw them in toy stores, but they're just not worth it. I would stick with finding the Kenner figures if you can. I'd say as a result of the underperformance of the Kenner figures and the definitive underperformance of LJN that there were no figures that were licensed for Last Crusade in 1989. Weirdly enough, though, there was a company called Star Toys, and Star Toys had the license to do some Indiana Jones figures, but the timeline's a little weird. I've seen 1987 was released, for 1989 was released, but there were just these little flimsy looking toys that looked nothing like Harrison Ford that were just the same figure but with removable clothing. And so you had like one that had just his shirt with the whip. There was another figure with him looking like the Boy Scout that River Phoenix played as young Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, the opening scene. But it's Harrison Ford dressed like this, and he's got a big machine gun. And there's another figure with him shirtless with his bag and a machine gun and his hat and an alligator. So go figure there. These are very rare to find, and yet I hear they could be picked up for less than $100. I don't know if I believe that. I've heard that there were giveaways for a Pepsi pack. I don't know the whole story, but these are very rare to find and likely not worth getting if you see them because they seem to be almost like bootlegs. And it's not surprising given how cheaply produced that they were made. So, in what I consider to be the dark ages of both the Star Wars and the Indiana Jones franchise, we also got Micro Machines. And I know this is an action figure podcast, but I want to just mention this because I collected the Micro Machines sets that they were making for Indiana Jones. And they did a couple of different box sets for all of the films. And so there was a big box set that had like all the vehicles from each of the three movies. So like Raiders had the German staff car, the Flying Wing, the Pan Am plane, the B plane that he goes into when he escapes from the Doom Ball scene. Temple of Doom has the mine cart. It has the plane that they take to India, and there's also the car that when he escapes the pallet, that little cafe in Shanghai. And Last Crusade, they have the wooden motorboat from the Venice scene, the German plane blimp, and the German tank from that big fight scene at the end. And also there were some smaller packs. There were a couple of prototypes set for play sets as well. But I guess much like the previous incarnations of toys, nobody bought them because they want to be Indiana Jones. They don't want to play with Indiana Jones. I also cannot go without talking about the Disney theme park exclusives. Albert Albanese and I discussed some of these previously in the Disney episode that we did, but these were probably the rarest of the rare. Only if you go to Disney would you be able to see these for the Indiana Jones stunt show. There were a few figures that have only 5 parts of articulation, much like the Kenner figures, but they were a little bit taller. They're actually 1 inch taller than the Kenner ones. There was an Indiana Jones with the revolver, the whip, the sword, and the torch. And then there were a whole bunch of figures that were made in the second set with Indy without the jacket. You had a Marion figure. You had a regular German soldier, not Indiana Jones disguised as a German soldier. They made the German mechanic, and they made the Cairo swordsman. All have 5 points of articulation, different accessories, and yes, even the Marion figure has the monkey with it, but not the dress. This time it has the outfit she wears when she first goes to Cairo. So this was almost like a nice little throwback to the Kenner figures. Unfortunately, most of these figures look very little like their actors, especially the Marion figure. So they're probably worth buying if you go to the Disney parks, but they're also ridiculously expensive, like anything. I'm sure Albert could probably attest to it because he's been to Disney more times than I have. But these are probably, I would say they're the better figures than what we're going to talk about next. But otherwise, these are very expensive to get and only exclusive to Disney. And there was a brief period as well where they had an Indiana Jones doll that you could also buy at Disney, and it was produced by Hasbro under the G.I. Joe line, which I thought was very interesting. But more interesting than that, that I don't think a lot of people know, they made a black Indiana Jones doll, which is just unbelievable to see. And the reason they did this, I'm reading now, one of the stunt performers for this Indiana Jones stunt show happened to be African American, and they allowed this actor to play Indiana Jones for a brief period of time, so they decided to make a doll of his likeness. I am not making a joke about this at all. I'm not even looking down on this. I'm thinking, you know what, that's pretty damn cool. Now, there may be some folks out there listening to this podcast that might start picking up their torches and their pitchforks, but this is unbelievable and very subversive. I don't think anybody knows about this, and if I'm like one of the few people on YouTube that's bringing this up, I'm proud to say that I found that there was a black Indiana Jones figure produced that we never had it as a movie, but we had it as a stunt show. So kudos to Hasbro and kudos to Disney for this. Now, I know there's a whole bunch of other Indiana Jones models and dolls and other sets of figures that I'm not really getting too much into because I don't want to take up too much time. I know these things go too long, and sometimes some people don't like to hear my voice. So I want to start wrapping it up by talking about the figures that came out in conjunction with the release of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in 2008. I, like everybody else in America, was waiting for a fourth Indiana Jones movie for a very long time and was pretty excited when we finally got it. I'm probably one of the few people that can honestly say that I saw this film in the theater and I actually enjoyed it at the time. Only in the months after did I realize there was a huge backlash, and I understand the reasons for it: nuking the fridge, the use of the CGI over practical effects, Mutt Williams, played by Shia LaBeouf, and a whole bunch of other issues that people had with this film. Nonetheless, it still made a lot of money. Major critics at the time gave it positive reviews. Only in the later periods that they start, having those retrospectives that it wasn't as good as they thought it was. But Hasbro, now taking over from Kenner, they were still riding high with Star Wars figures. They thought maybe they could recapture the magic of Indiana Jones and go all the way this time and not hesitate. So they not only made figures for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but they also decided to make legacy figures for the entire series in 2008 and in 2011. I'm not going to get too far into these, and there's a reason why. So they managed to make virtually every character from every movie. We got all the same characters, of course, that they made in 82 and 83, from Indy to Sala to Belloc in the robe. But there were also other figures that we never really got from that period. We got the German soldier, first of all, and not the German soldier that Indy was disguised as. They went all out with Temple of Doom. They made a Willie Scott in the robe and outfit that she wore. They gave us a short round in the proper sizing. They made a different Mola Ram figure and a different Temple Guard figure for this set. And for the first time ever, we got figures from the Last Crusade. So for those who wanted a River Phoenix young Indy, or wanted Sean Connery's Dr. Henry Jones, Colonel Vogel, Elsa, the Grail Knight at the end of the movie, now we got those guys. And, we got all the accessories that go along with them. We even, going back to Raiders, we even got Alf Molina's character from the first scene, just before the Doomball moment, so he gets a figure. And then, of course, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull would have most of the main characters that you remember from that film. You have the older Indy with the bazooka. You have Mutt Williams with and without the jacket. You have Kate Blanchett's Irina Spalko, the Russian baddie in the movie. Her Russian soldier henchman. The Mayans from the film. We even got a Crystal Skull figure from this set and you actually had to collect 6 stickers. And I guess this was like sort of their little mail away figure if you were interested. We also got a bunch of deluxe figures. So, like, there would be some indie figures that would have the Temple Trap, the Temple Pitfall. There were double sets if you wanted Marion with the Cairo Henchmen, if you wanted 2 Cairo Thugs, 2 German soldiers. They made the Cairo Horse. They made Williams Motorcycle. And there were so many other. I mean, you had Pops, you had the Adventure Heroes line, but I want to stick with the 3 and a quarter inch figures that they made because they weren't, you know, I wanted to be more excited for these when this film came out. And to tell you the truth, I never collected them because I thought the heads were poorly produced. They look nothing like the actors. They look so flimsy compared to the Kenner figures. And they're just so much hard plastic around some of those dresses and the lack of texture and detail. It just, they don't do it for me. And I don't think it did it for kids either because, once again, kids want to be Indiana Jones. They don't want to play with Indiana Jones. And certainly in 2008, in addition to the backlash to Kingdom, it's just the kids didn't respond to it the same way they'd respond to Star Wars. And I think that's the main reason why these figures, despite the push to really sell these, were not really the biggest sellers. You just take one look at that packaging and you just feel like, God, these look awful. So that's why I don't think these really did all that well. So now, as for the future of the indie line, we know there's a 5th film that's currently being shot right now under the Disney owned Lucasfilm. And there's a lot of speculation as to what that's going to be like. I've heard about a time travel plot. I've heard about maybe old Indy encountering young Indy. And it's supposed to be set in the 60s, but they may time travel back to the 40s. I mean, I don't have much hope, quite honestly, for this new Indiana Jones film. And it comes down to a number of factors. First of all, Steven Spielberg's not directing it. George Lucas is not writing this script. Harrison Ford is going to be 80 years old this year. And we already know he's had a couple of injuries on this set, which is not a good sign. And if there's any indication of my own concerns with this, it's just you look at these recent Star Wars movies, outside of what they've done on Disney Plus with The Mandalorian and The Book of Boba Fett, they've dropped the ball completely on what we grew up with. And I just feel like in the wrong hands, it's just not going to go well. Part of me hopes I'm wrong, but I just have this sense we're not going to be in such a good mood when this film comes out. I believe in the coming year. It was supposed to come out this summer, but delays resulted in its delay for next summer of 2023. So, will we get figures? Time will tell. Likely Hasbro would handle it again if there are, but in this day and age, I have my doubts that we'll get much out of it, nor do I think they'll really be big sellers. They may just go back to the well and just make figures from the older films if necessary. So those are my thoughts on the next indie film. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you think about these action figures, if you've collected them, if you have memories of them. And as always, please subscribe to our Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter. All the info's down on the bottom. And as I said, there's still going to be a couple more episodes I plan to do, just not as consistently as I would like, just because of my time these days. But I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will see you guys in the